Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Sandra Harding and her program or her view on strong objectivity, this concept. So Sandra Harding is a really important figure in feminist epistemology or feminist philosophy of science. And feminist philosophy of science is going to include a sort of core insight, which is that the claim that historically the practice of science has been influenced by a number of embedded social biases, including biases about gender, race, class, or other marginalized groups of people that are going to emerge in the sort of, these biases are going to emerge in the kinds of results that science is able to produce, the sort of knowledge that science is able to produce as a practice. And it's also going to have a big effect on how research methods are framed, the sort of framing assumptions that go into research methods, and just the sort of program of knowledge acquisition more generally. And so this is very related to social epistemology more broadly, which is sort of the loose theme of this module, looking at how our social world, including maybe relationships of power, affect how we can know things, what we can know, and maybe who we consider experts on certain things, who we consider authorities, etc. So those are some of the things that we're sort of concerned with in this unit. And feminist philosophers of science and many other social epistemologist types are going to say that there's often a connection between who is in power and the sort of standard accepted knowledge paradigms of the time. So Thomas Kuhn is a famous philosopher of science who writes about this, and Michel Foucault is another famous philosopher who really talks about the relationship between knowledge and power, and is essentially going to say that what we call knowledge is often simply a function of power. So Sandra Harding's goal, one of her goals, is to sort of push back on this implicit, this sort of unacknowledged but implicit idea in the sciences or in knowledge production more generally that might, meaning power, equals right. So she's going to critique, along with other social epistemologists, this idea that what we call knowledge and how we achieve knowledge is just a function of who is in power. So she's also going to critique what is called the view from nowhere, which is a phrase that's going to appear in her essay a little bit, which is sort of the position that, or the idea that the ideal position from which to conduct knowledge inquiry is this sort of blank slate position. And it involves the assumption that people are able to rid themselves of any biases that they may have and take on a more purely rational individual position from which to evaluate the world around them and build knowledge about the world around them. So it's going to have the idea that people are able to reach a sort of epistemic position of inquiry in which they're completely unaffected by their own ideals, their values, and their biases. So sometimes a similar idea is sort of called the value-free ideal of inquiry. And feminist philosophers, some of them are going to say, maybe this just isn't possible. So many of our beliefs are so embedded that and so related to the way our experiences of the world that maybe it's just not a feasible idea to or ideal to say that we should rid ourselves of every single thing that affects how we perceive the world. So Sandra Harding specifically is a famous proponent of what is called standpoint epistemology. And this is a very crucial part of just feminist epistemology more generally. And one of the basic insights from standpoint epistemology is that one's social position is going to influence what one knows about the world around them and how one perceives the world around them. So this means that it's going to affect the kind of knowledge that you have access to. So you might think your specific social position is going to affect what you know. Your specific life experiences are going to affect just basically what you would say you know. And it's also going to have the idea that we are all influenced, which is not necessarily uniformly influenced, not necessarily influenced in the exact same ways, but influenced nonetheless by our specific social position within hierarchical society. So this means not only that the knowledge we have access to is influenced by our social positions, but that the assumptions we make, our values, and our general outlook is going to be greatly influenced by our social position. So standpoint epistemology is going to then call into question the very possibility of, like I said, this view from nowhere, or this value-free outlook that sort of maybe more standard epistemologies have, or standard philosophies of science have argued is the ideal position from which to conduct scientific inquiry. So one of Sandra Harding's claims is that, sort of her essential claim here in this strong objectivity work, is that while proponents of standard scientific practices believe they are being objective, they're actually not being objective enough. So she's going to draw an important distinction between weak objectivity and strong objectivity. So weak objectivity, she's going to say, is what sort of the practices of most scientific communities rely on. This is going to kind of be the standard or the sort of goal. And so she's going to say that these sort of more traditional communities, scientific research communities, only achieve weak objectivity because they're very homogenous. Historically, they've been very homogenous, meaning that the members of these communities are all really similarly socially situated. So they lack a diversity of perspective. She's going to say that for a long time, these communities left out the perspectives of women, of people of color, and of working class people. And so this, she's going to say, is why we get, or in the past have gotten scientific theories about racial superiority, or which the Nazis had a lot of scientific research programs that they were engaged in that were based on certain assumptions about racial superiority. And these really affected the kind of research that they did, and then the kind of results that they were able to get. And she's going to say that programs like these got their start because of a really homogenous scientific community that had a lot of shared beliefs about the superiority of the kind of identities that the people in those communities shared. So Sandra Harding is going to say that what we need to do in our scientific communities is actually strive for a higher level of objectivity, because some people are going to critique standpoint epistemologies by saying, well, if you acknowledge that your values are affecting how you perceive the world, then you're less objective, and you aren't being a sort of good scientist, you aren't being sort of a good inquirer. But Sandra Harding is going to say we actually need to be more rigorous. We actually need to strive for a higher degree of objectivity. And so she sets forth this program of strong objectivity. And the basic insight or proposition that she makes is that your standpoint, which includes your social experiences, your social position, your life experiences, your beliefs, your values, has an effect on the way you interpret the world and therefore on your work. Thus, because of that, she proposes that the best way to increase the objectivity of our methods of inquiry and of our knowledge that we then reap from these methods of inquiry is to have more diverse knowledge-seeking communities. So that means people who have really different, maybe people of different races, people of different genders, but also people who just have really different background life experiences. So the idea, one of the ideas in her piece is that there's this false distinction between objectivity and relativity. And so the idea instead from her is that objectivity comes in degrees, and you can be more or less objective. You aren't just either objective or relative. It's a sort of range, and that objectivity is something that's sort of achieved through communities of inquirers. So rather than the idea that that objectivity is something is achieved through just one knower who rids themselves of all their biases and all their values and sort of achieves this position of a purely rational actor. She's going to say, as in the kind of view from nowhere ideal, she's going to say it's something that is more of a social achievement that we as scientific groups and communities can achieve. So that is sort of a rough rundown on strong objectivity and sort of how it connects to social epistemology more broadly. But in the next paper, we're also going to talk a little bit more about standpoint epistemology. So maybe keep some of those ideas in mind moving forward.